Hello, everyone. We are delighted and excited to have you here with us. I am thrilled to have my co-host, David Crow, as our guest. David Crow is a master herbalist, master clinical herbalist, researcher, and author specializing in Chinese, Tibetan, and Ayurvedic medicines and their spiritual lineages. Thousands of students have attended his online courses, both at the Shift Network and through his medical consultation website. David, it's lovely to be speaking with you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Salima. Always nice to see you.
So many people come to herbal medicine because they want to heal, their physical bodies. So you're going to illuminate us on the many roads of herbalism. If healing the body is only one level, what are the others and how did you come to discover them?
Excellent question. Well, there are many different systems that are articulated in different medical traditions. And we can find really good examples of this in Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, where if you study those traditions, then what you find is that the healing of the body is basically inseparable from the healing of the mind and from the healing of the emotions and the spirit and the environment and so many different things. So really, when we're talking about old classical Asian medical systems, we're talking about systems that had a deep understanding of the body-mind interface, and they didn't make separations between the mind and the emotions and the body as much as we make it in physical modern medicine. Right. So modern medicine, of course, is really looking at, the blood work and liver functions and, the physical part of things. And it's recognizing more and more that the mind and the emotions play a huge role in all of this, of course. But in the classical Asian medical systems, this was always inseparable. And that's why there's so much emphasis classically on the integration between herbal medicine and spiritual practices. And what we see then is that the lineages of herbal medicine were really inseparable from the lineages of meditation, and they were inseparable from the lineages of, the cultures that they came from. Like, for example, Chinese medicine is inseparable from Qigong and from Taoism. And Ayurvedic medicine is inseparable from the Vedas and from Tantra and yoga. And if we look at how the medicines used to be used, they were always used in some integrated way with meditation practice and prayer and ceremony and offerings and many different ways of activating healing of the mind and healing of the emotions. So really, the way I came to it is simply because I was studying classical Asian medicine. And in those systems, the integration between physical medicine and healing the mind and healing the emotions and the spirit, it's just part of it. Now, the implications of this, however, are not fully articulated. If you go to acupuncture school, for example, they don't delve into the implications of these things as deeply as they could. And this has been my own personal journey also, is trying to find what does it actually mean if we study the spiritual lineages that these medical systems came from? What does it mean if we actually study Qigong while we are studying Chinese medicine, or if we actually study the Vedas when we're studying Ayurveda? What does it actually show us? And what it shows us is a very profound cosmology that is underlying both the spiritual practices and the medical practices. And so the cosmology then is very important to understand. And that's true of every medical system, not just classical Asian medicine, but every traditional medicine, shamanic, indigenous medicine all over the world has cosmology as well. And the more we understand the cosmology, then the more we understand what sickness means at different levels. And the more we understand what sickness means at different levels, the more we understand about how to treat it at different levels. So this is a huge subject, of course. This is something that we could explore in a lot of detail. And so with that brief introduction, maybe I'll just turn it back to you and say, well, what particular aspect of this would you like to go into more detail with? This is a huge subject.
It really is a huge subject. And one of the things that you really illuminated that I think we see in our studies, especially as like Western herbalists, we don't see that integration of mind body. We don't see that in our medical paradigm. And I always thought it was strange that modern medicine is the only medicine that does not place an emphasis or put a connection to the emotions, our thought patterns, our spirituality. But I am glad, as you said, that that is beginning to change. And so you mentioned that there are levels. What are those different levels?
Well, there's different ways of explaining that. And I can just share a few examples of systems that we can compare. One of the interesting things that has come out just in this summit, actually, in conversation with a few of my guests, is the cosmology of medical systems, like, for example, from the Andes. And in that system, which was articulated so beautifully by our guest Freddy Quispe, he shared how in that particular culture, they view plants as part of a family. And they classify plants then grandparent plants. Those are plants that have great spiritual power, like ayahuasca, visionary plants, and parent plants, the plants that take care of us the most, like food plants, and then the children plants. These are like the plants that are everywhere. And those are a lot of the medicines that we use. Now, that's a system of classifying plants, and that's also a way of understanding. If we classify plants in this system, that gives us information about what they're used for and how they can treat different levels of the body. So the parent plants are used for the nutritional support for medical conditions, whereas the grandparent plants are used more for spiritual purposes, visionary purposes. Now, we find the same thing in classical Asian medicine. And one of the primary differences between shamanism and this kind of cosmology of shamanism that is found in many parts of the world and classical Asian medicine is that in the cosmology of shamanism, there's very much a strong emphasis on spirit and our interconnectedness with nature, and on the community aspect of plants, family, animals, earth, these kind of things. So it's really a nature-based kind of medical system. And that's the oldest medical system. That's the most widespread. But something really interesting happened historically in classical Asian medicine, going back several thousand years, and that was that the emphasis became enlightenment. The emphasis became liberation, illumination. And it was called all these different things from different cultures. For example, moksha is the term that's used in yoga and the Vedas, moksha, liberation. Liberation from bondage, freedom from this world. And this is a really fundamental difference in priorities then, in terms of what are we doing spiritually and what are we doing medically and why are we doing anything? And therefore the emphasis completely changed from a kind of earth-based religion to an enlightenment-focused spiritual traditions. And the medicine, therefore, became strongly influenced by that. And so what we see then is if we look at Taoism, if we look at Buddhism, if we look at all of the different lineages of meditation practice, Tantra and Vipassana, and all of these things, many of which are here now in our culture, if we look at these, they have a goal. And that goal is defined in many different ways according to different places in history, times and places in history of these lineages. And it's called different things. It's called enlightenment. It's called self-realization. It's called satori, awakening. It's called Buddha nature. It's called Atma or Brahma. It's called so many different things. But the focus is transcendent of this world. Okay. Now, that completely changed the focus of medicine. And this is where I first came into contact with this in my studies with Dr. Ngawang Chopo in Nepal, who was a Tibetan Lama, who was a Tibetan doctor, and he immediately began giving me these teachings 40 years ago about Tibetan medicine. And in Tibetan medicine, the goal of medicine is not just healing the body. It's actually very clearly defined. And I later found that this system is also in Chinese medicine. And it's also in Ayurveda in different ways. And what they say, which is really thought-provoking, actually, what they say is that using herbs to treat physical illness is the lowest level of herbal medicine. Now, that's thought-provoking because anybody who is sick doesn't want anything more than to feel better. And if medicine can help, they will do it. If pharmaceuticals will help, they will do it. And if a plant can cure you, then they will have great appreciation. People have great appreciation for plant-based medicine when it cures them, when it relieves pain, suffering, inflammation, insomnia, whatever. And so it's difficult to understand why that statement is made. Why is it that herbal medicine is like the lowest? Or why is it that medicine in general, why any form of medicine is considered to be inferior? Well, that's because there are higher goals than just treating the body. And so therefore, in this system, medicine itself is considered only the beginning, the lowest level. And then the level above that is prevention. And of course, we find that in lots of systems everywhere. And prevention is superior because it's a lot easier to take care of ourselves than to try to cure something. So that's a higher level of medicine is prevention. And we have some of that in our culture. You know, doctors will tell you to smoke. Tell you to stop smoking and tell you to eat better and get more exercise. That's part of it. But in this system of classification that I learned from my teacher of Tibetan medicine, there's a third level. And that's based on the question, why? Why should we practice preventive medicine? And the answer is longevity. So there is a goal. It's not just medicine for treating illness. It's also for preventing illness. And the goal of that is longevity. So there's a purpose. It's not just, all right, we're taking these things for no reason at all. We're taking them because we want to live a long life. Now comes the most important question. Why live a long life? And we see lots of interesting existential questions here because modern medicine has prolonged life. There's no doubt about it. It has increased the quantity of life, but the question that comes with it is, has it improved the quality of life? And so anybody who has visited an elder in a convalescent home knows that, okay, we're keeping these people in their 90s alive, but in a lot of cases, it can be accurately said that they're virtually vegetables. And that's not a high quality of life. And this is where these medical systems really say something important. And that is the role of medicine is to treat illness. But that's the beginning. And then the role of medicine is to prevent illness, and that's better. And then the purpose of that is to have a long life. But the purpose of a long life is clearly articulated, and that's what's most important here. It is not just so we have a long life. It is so we have a long life with, and these are very specific points that are made in places like Ayurvedic texts. They say long life with freedom of the limbs, ability to move around, and happiness and fully functioning senses, all right? So that we can actually still be in the world and be independent, and our sense organs are working. And most importantly, our cognitive functions are still intact. Now, that's the higher level of medicine itself, but there's even something beyond that. And we say, well, why? What's the purpose of that? There's lots of people who can do that. Lots of people who can live till their 80s and 90s and still be in relatively good shape. But that doesn't mean that we have accomplished anything spiritually. And there's lots of examples of less than spiritual people who have had long, healthy lives. But what it really comes down to then is that medicine is described as being the foundation for spiritual accomplishment. And it is clearly illustrated in the old Tibetan medical texts and other places that if you take care of the body at this level first, clear out the illnesses, and then prevent the illness from coming back, and then develop longevity, and longevity with a fully functioning brain and sense organs, that gives you the maximum amount of time in this life to complete the long, difficult journey of reaching enlightenment. So that's the full picture there.
I love that. That's amazing. And it's a very clear, it feels like a pyramid, and what do I can also see that inspiring maybe a feeling of lack of accomplishment in folks who have perhaps not gotten out of illness yet. And so does that mean that I'll never be able to reach the heights of my spiritual enlightenment or my spiritual consciousness that I can attain in this lifetime?
Well, that's really important because what I just described is very idealistic. It's kind of like the utopian spiritual goal. And in a fully intact, integrated culture where people had the ability to do all of these things, there were lots of examples of practitioners, meditators, yogis, yoginis, Ayurvedic physicians, doctors, who were able to fully practice all of these things for an extended period of time, both medically and in terms of their deep contemplative practices. And they could live to, great old age and accomplish things spiritually. But these were different days. Those were different times, different cultures, different conditions where the society really supported people in doing that. And people were living in much cleaner environments. And many of the diseases that we have now, they'd never heard of before. And so conditions were more conducive for this kind of deep practice in many cultures. And that's one answer. But there's an even more important answer. And that is that enlightenment or illumination or an ultimate spiritual goal, whatever we want to call it, and that's an entirely different subject. What is it? But whatever the ultimate spiritual goal is, it is not dependent on health. You see, so even though I just articulated this pyramid of, yes, these are optimal circumstances, we have the opportunity for spiritual growth in every moment and every condition. It's just how do we practice with different things? I'm reminded of a question that was once asked of one of my greatest spiritual teachers, Kalu Rinpoche, the elder Kalu Rinpoche. His reincarnation is now back in teaching, but the elder Kalu Rinpoche, when he was very old, And he was a true yogi who practiced in snow caves with just a little cotton cloth. He was like the real thing. And someone asked him, he was in San Francisco giving teachings many decades ago. And he was asked, what is the role of health and enlightenment? And he said, well, if enlightenment was based on health, there'd be a lot of people in America who were enlightened. You see, so even though the first system articulates that we would like to have a long, healthy life so that we can practice deeply and achieve something spiritually, that doesn't mean that we're going to have those conditions. And they're kind of rare and precious, actually, more increasingly so. And so what he was saying, well, there's not a link. So it's a paradox that, yes, we can have all these optimal conditions and not be spiritual people, or we can have terrible conditions and be very spiritual people. And I think that that's something that you and I both know from clinical practice, and that is, we have heard cancer patients tell us that cancer has been their greatest teacher. And if we look at it from that standpoint, then what is the spiritual motivation? It's impermanence, and it's facing our mortality, and it's the physical discomfort, and it's the fact that our time here, we are recognizing our time as being very, very, very brief. And then we are having to deal with pain. And this is where these medical systems interface with spiritual practices as well. And so one of the best examples I can think of is that I have taught Vipassana meditation, classic Vipassana meditation that was taught to me to patients in hospice, in hospitals, okay? And this is a kind of meditation practice that helps us to gain insight. That is what Vipassana means, insight meditation. It gives us insight into the true nature of reality that is occurring right now in the body. And for a lot of people, there is no real interest in spiritual practice until we are confronted with impermanence and suffering. And I think that this is actually one of the greatest collective opportunities that is now emerging for all of humanity, because we are every day getting closer and closer to the collective realization that our environment may not be here pretty soon. We may not have a habitable world, which means collective impermanence. And out of that, we could go several different ways, just as individuals go several different ways when they get a diagnosis of a terminal illness. They can say, well, never mind, and just continue having fun and enjoy life as much as possible. Or they can become highly self-destructive or destructive in other ways, harmful to society and to others. Or they ask deeper questions about, why am I here? What am I really trying to accomplish? What will make me happy? Really, how to use this life in the best possible way. And so these are natural questions that happen during illness. And these are natural questions that people have to address in different ways, or not address, avoid them, deny them, whatever. But for those who are already oriented to a kind of meditation practice, then if a serious illness comes, then we have a way to integrate it into spiritual practice. And so illness becomes a spiritual practice. And that's the main difference between the kind of ideal, perfect situation of having our whole life free of illness so that we can practice meditation. And then suddenly, on the other side, maybe we're not going to have that. Maybe, we got COVID, and all of a sudden everything fell apart. And now we've got long COVID, and we're debilitated, and maybe it's turning into a critical autoimmune disease. And all of a sudden, everything we thought about life is completely falling apart. And that is many times the doorway for people into rapid, accelerated transformation.
And then there's my question around, because I like to explain, or at least share the idea with folks that we don't have to experience rock bottom or severe illness in order to realize that the meaning of life was about our spiritual centeredness. And yet I understand that is some people's path, right? But how can we, both as teachers, practitioners, encourage people? How do you encourage people to not wait until it's late? It's never too late, but to not wait until it's late to adopt a spiritual practice, and particularly one that integrates herbal medicine?
Well, I think some of this is really individual, because there are many people who are very well established in their practices. There are many people now who have been doing very deep contemplative spiritual practices 30, 40 years. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who don't know how to make a cup of chamomile tea yet and don't know basic relaxation practices. So really, it has to do with who are we talking to and what are their levels of needs and what are they open to. And so this is what I have found to be a very important aspect of herbal medicine, is that many people are more interested in getting rid of their symptoms than they are in a spiritual practice. But their body's telling them something. And in many cases, what the body is telling them is directly pointing to a need for a deeper transformation. And so therefore, herbal medicine becomes a doorway into spiritual practice that otherwise maybe people wouldn't be interested in. And so really the doorway into spirituality through herbal medicine is body-mind interface, because people have symptoms, they don't feel well. And I'll just share a very typical kind of progression that happens in my clinical practice, which I'm sure is the same in yours. And that is that people come with physical symptoms, they don't feel well. And so you work with them with basic changes of diet and basic herbs. And at a certain point, if not right away, the factors of mind and emotions and spirit are just so obvious that they have to be addressed. And therefore, what happens in my consultations is that fairly quickly, after people have made a few basic changes and they're starting to feel better and they're starting to incorporate their herbs, then we get serious. And it's like, okay, herbal medicine can help you up to a certain point with your anxiety, and it can help you up to a certain point with your insomnia. And all of that's going to have, it'll go up to a certain point with your inflammation and so forth. But then you're going to have to go deeper. And there are herbs that will do things to you. You can take cannabis and it will do things to you, but in many cases, we can't use those herbs for extended periods of time, and we shouldn't use those herbs for extended periods of time, because we shouldn't be relying on anything doing things to us. And that is fairly true for pharmaceuticals also. We shouldn't depend on the medications to do things to us. So the question then comes, well, how much of this can we do ourselves physiologically? And that's where it gets really interesting, because we can only influence our physiology very minimally and very indirectly. we can make changes in our diet and that improves things. We can make changes in our sleep patterns if we can, and that improves things. But if we really want to change our physiology, we have to go pretty deeply into some kind of internal practice where the mind is focused in the body. And that's where spirituality starts to directly link. Now, we don't have to call it spirituality, and it doesn't have to be from any culture. It doesn't have to be Buddhist or yoga or this or that or anything. It can be physiology. But physiology means that we start paying close attention to the body. Well, what is that? That's mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Classically, that's Vipassana meditation. So we see then that it's really fundamental to all these spiritual traditions to work with the body. And therefore, we start to pay more attention to our breathing. Well, what is that? Well, we could call it pranayama, but it's also just mindfulness of our breath. We start to learn that if we want to get better beyond what the basic lifestyle changes and herbal medicines will help us do, we have to learn an increasingly higher level. We have to learn an increasingly higher level of physiological control. Now, that's something very important to think about. What could happen if we could actually control our physiology directly? Well, that would be miraculous. We wouldn't need doctors. We wouldn't need drugs. We wouldn't need herbs. We could just adjust our hormone levels at will. That would be great. Now, can we do that? Yes, theoretically. But it takes a lot of practice and a lot of time to do things. Like in these yogic traditions, there are examples of this where people have achieved high levels of physiological control. Now, those high levels of physiological control are also deeply spiritual in nature, you see, because the more we learn how to control our own anxiety, the more we learn that we can actually stop those heart palpitations ourselves. That's fairly basic, okay? People can learn how to do that. The more we learn that we can do these things physiologically, the more empowered we become as patients, and the more it starts to look like, oh, this is a spiritual path of self-cultivation, of self-transformation at a very deep level. And we're going from being a person who has a lot of anxiety and stress to being a person who knows how to be relaxed most of the time. That's a sign of spiritual accomplishment, actually. Now, that's where the herbs interface beautifully. So you and I both see lots of cases where people come in and they say, I've tried all these sleep herbs and they don't work. Well, that doesn't mean that it's not the right thing. It just means that they're not doing something to you, okay? Well, then the question becomes, should the herbs do something to us? Yeah, we can knock ourselves out with something, but that's not doing our karmic homework. That's not doing what we need to do to change ourselves. That's where the herbs are partners in the healing process. And so many of the herbs will not do things to us at the level we want, but they will help us do things for ourselves at the level that we need. And that's where we get this concept of illuminated herbalism, where we integrate the use of herbs with meditation practice. And if we take 5 minutes, do a deliberate relaxation practice, and we're drinking that relaxing tea works 100 times better. And that relaxation practice works 100 times better. So that's where all of this has gone for me in my clinical practice, is really kind of understanding that herbs and spiritual practice interface, they potentize each other. And that actually is how the old traditions used to be.
This is such a timely conversation. I was just talking to a client about the very same thing that you were talking about, how we're reaching this level of the formula was working and then it stopped. And it's like, how do I collect myself and say, you have to do the inner work? It's like we always are continuing to push in a gentle and graceful way our clients along the path, that it's like the herb doesn't do the work for you. There's nothing that replaces our participation and like our proactive care and attention to our own body. So it's such a timely conversation.
What did you tell them?
I haven't written them back yet. I have to take my time to process and formulate a compassionate response. So I'm not like, because it's a repeated conversation, it's like, okay, how do I say it another way that it can be received?
Right. And that's what I mean. It's very individual, everybody is different in terms of how ready they are to work on themselves, how able they are to work on themselves, what resources they have, how much time they have. And we know that just the reality of the two of us talking about this indicates that you and I have incredible good fortune karmically to have studied this kind of medicine and to actually have the ability to talk about these things, because so much of the suffering in the world is entirely based on lack of resources, socioeconomic factors. And it's important to understand that many times people blame themselves a lot for conditions that are actually not coming from past trauma or not coming from you're not working on yourself enough, or it's, you have negative thoughts or things like this. People are really hard on themselves when it comes to expecting that the emotional work they are doing, the spiritual work that they are doing, that it should translate into physical healing. And that's not always the case. And in a lot of cases, what we're really dealing with here is a global karma, not an individual karma, a global karma or a national karma that has created conditions for people where they can't even take the time to attend a summit, and they can't afford natural medicine, and they can't even afford healthy food, and they have no time to do any of this. And so this is actually something that is important to acknowledge, that there's so much suffering everywhere because of lack of simple resources that people can do these kinds of things. But once we have the conditions, then if we use them wisely, then we can start to make real progress. And as people make progress with their spiritual practice, and even if they can just have a basic healing diet and a basic home pharmacy, the quality of their life begins to improve and their energy level begins to improve, their mental and emotional state begins to improve, and that can change everything. That can change individual karma very, very dramatically. So in this pyramid that we talked about, that includes a lot of magical synchronistic things that can happen when people start to work on themselves physically and spiritually, that can lead to a higher quality of life as well. So I had to interject that.
No, I love that. And as we change our individual karma, we change collective karma. It's like the work that we do on ourselves has this ripple effect that is profound, and we can't see it. And it's a ripple effect of good. And people have to learn to trust that, right? And so I want to change gears because I want to know, based on the title of your talk, what are the 2 flowers and the 3 fruits?
Of course, and this is really summing everything up. What are these flowers and fruits? And this is the illustration that is in the Tibetan medical system. So when I was studying with Dr. Chopal, he had escaped from Tibet after being in concentration camps, basically, after the Chinese took over. And he carried out a few scrolls, tankas, of the medical teachings to preserve. And he started his monastery over again in Kathmandu. And I was able to study with him, where he was showing me these old scrolls of the Tibetan medical paintings that had been used for centuries and centuries to illustrate the Tibetan medical system. And in this system, one of the scrolls shows these different trees, and these are the trees of health and disease and branches of medicine and so forth. And so this image then is a tree, and the tree has different branches. And this particular tree that he was teaching me about is the tree of the body in good health. And it shows all these different branches. These branches are things like Vata, Pitta, Kapha, which is there in Tibetan medicine, the three humors. Okay, so the constitutional elements are in balance, and then the five elements are in balance, and then the elimination of the wastes are in balance. And this tree shows these different branches of the body in good health. And then at the top of the tree, there are two flowers. And sometimes it's more, but different systems. This one that he was showing me, two flowers, and then out of these two flowers, there are three fruits. Now, what do those represent? The flowers mean the freedom from disease. And that's one of them, freedom from disease. And the other flower means longevity. So in other words, if we have this tree of the body in balance with Vata, Pitta, Kapha, the humors and elements and the wastes and so forth, we will have two flowers later in life, which will be freedom from disease and longevity. And then there are three fruits. And again, there's different systems, but the one he was showing me are described very simply as material well-being, prosperity. How's that? Okay, so prosperity is one of the fruits of having good health and longevity. And the second fruit, happiness. And the third fruit, spirituality. So in other words, if we can open the two flowers of longevity and freedom from disease, then what will come out of those will be prosperity and happiness and spirituality. Now, spirituality is defined in a really interesting way in this particular Tibetan medical system, which is based on things like the Kala Chakra Tantra and Dzogchen and these high levels of meditation practice. And so spirituality then is defined further. This is the fruit, and I'll give you this exact quote. I can't say it any better. The fruit of obtaining unsurpassed enlightenment, which liberates the psycho-spiritual components in the body of light, achieving ultimate bliss. So, wow, that's a pretty lofty goal. And that's coming from traditions where people are reputed to actually have disappeared into light. They dematerialized their body. It was considered a yogic accomplishment. It was considered something that we can do, is that if we go deeply enough into the nature of reality, that we can actually withdraw our consciousness from the elements of the body at such a deep level that the elements come back with us into their origin, which is primordial consciousness, which is what we projected those elements from originally into matter. And so at this higher level of these kind of tantric teachings, what we hear about is how we incarnate, that the elements of the body actually come from our consciousness into matter. And then if we know that and we know how to withdraw them, then they disappear at the time of death. And that's a different definition of immortality. So that's a pretty lofty accomplishment. And I've heard some rumors of some things, even fairly recently, but I have no aspirations for that. I think that's completely unrealistic for myself. But we find this system of two flowers and three fruits very close to another system that people may be familiar with. In Ayurveda, the four aims of life. And so those four aims of life, again, prosperity and wealth and love, okay? And the ability to do our duty in society. Those three are the aims of life. And so they're very similar to the system. And then the fourth aim of life is, again, liberation, moksha, which is the same here. So those are the two flowers and the three fruits, and why we would like to have a healthy body ultimately, and the ultimate purpose of herbal medicine.
What a beautiful gift to be just of your teacher, like the beautiful gift of the experience that you had of your teacher and being able to continue and honor that legacy. And even thinking about that transcendence, I'm like, we can experience moments like milliseconds of that kind of bliss when we're in meditation. But I think there's definitely the fear is like, wait a minute, I don't want to disappear. I don't want to disappear, but this feels really good. How can people bring this into their day-to-day, into their modern, busy lives? What are some suggestions that you can inspire folks to move toward on their path?
Well, when we're talking about things like disappearing into light, I don't think that's a realistic goal anymore. And when it comes to living a long, healthy life, I think it is a realistic goal, but it is so dependent on conditions and good fortune, and increasingly challenging for a lot of people. And therefore, I would go back to another point that I made a couple times, and that is, I think it's really individual. And the conversation that I have over and over with people, as I know it is with you, is we start with where you are and what you need and how you can make progress with your health. And then we understand health is intimately linked to your mind and to your sleep and to the environment and to your relationships. We start to look at health more holistically. And then we start to understand the spiritual dimensions of all of that. And we start to understand the value of spiritual practices. We start to gradually incorporate the things that we are drawn to that we will do on a regular basis. We start practicing things that we feel an affinity to, a little bit more breathing exercises, a little bit more qigong, a little bit more sitting practice, a little bit more walking in nature. We just do those things a bit more. And our life begins to become better. We start to feel better. We start to become more happier. Our relationships improve. Our sleep improves. Our digestion improves. And then if we have the good fortune to go more deeply into those things, then we take more time and we may do a retreat and we may experience the hardships and the benefits of actually meditating for 10 days or doing some time in solitude in nature. There's lots and lots of ways that people have always done this in every culture, everywhere. And there's no one way to do it, and everything gives us different benefits, and everything also has some contraindications, some things we have to be careful about, not to try to detox too aggressively, or not to try to force ourselves to meditate when we actually need a massage, or not to try to force ourselves to be in isolation when we need to be in society. We need to approach these things in a balanced way that is appropriate for our constitution and our age and our strength and our vitality. And that's where our role as clinicians comes in, because a lot of people don't know that they shouldn't be doing such aggressive detox. They need more nourishment. A lot of people hear a lot of things and they try a lot of things that are not appropriate for their body, including spiritual practices. And that's where the integration of natural medicine and spirituality comes in again at the clinical level, is how to help people on their journey, basically, in whatever way is most appropriate for them. So that's how I would answer that. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that inner peace that we experience along the way, as you were suggesting, that's something to look forward to. And that's something that we can aspire to, that it's just like in my day to day, I just want to feel more at ease inside of myself. So thank you so much, David. Can you tell people where to learn more about you, learn more about your work, how to receive support from you?
Of course, and thank you for asking. The website where you can find me is really easy. It's crowconsultations.com, just like it sounds. CROW consultations.com. And that is where people can schedule to have a consultation with me, which includes medical. It includes also these other subjects. And I work with other practitioners as well at a clinical level. And it's also where there are some educational opportunities as well. I do that there and here at the Shift Network, of course. And so that is the website, crowconsultations.com.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you. We could keep going for a couple of hours.
Indeed. And thank you so much for excellent questions and prompting, and for being the co-host of this summit. I know that people are just going to love these sessions watching you. You have great interviewing skills and bring people out. And thank you for the good work that you do clinically as well with herbalism, and the way that you have integrated this into your own spiritual view of the world and helping people on all this, illuminated herbalism, this way of helping people. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.